This is hell.
The planet's on fire, so yes, this is hell, and not only is our planet on fire, but crop diversity is in danger too. It must be, as we are storing away seeds of endangered plants, so when we need them in a future of far less plant diversity than we currently have, and like I said, we must not have much of a future, and the future must be really bleak if we're storing away all these seeds in seed vaults. Why else would we have constructed places like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault? You may have seen images of the vault, a minimalist wedge shimmering in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, stuck in permafrost and thick rock to protect seed samples from the world's crop collections, just in case we need them to feed ourselves and survive in the future. Although you gotta admit, it's a weird way to preserve crop diversity by storing it away in a frozen locker to sit on shelves until who knows when. However, it's not that weird when you consider the history of crop diversity, how crops were abundant and diverse, that is, until modernity arrived with its science and research, ready to improve upon the natural world and make it, well, modern, and that meant better, or so they assumed, no longer being stewarded by indigenous cultures and instead controlled by Western civilization. So how did the crops people have depended upon for their survival for millennia become endangered? Why is it, for instance, that there were once numerous kinds of corn, but now we seem to be down to only one? Because corn is a huge part of the global diet, and if we are down to one kind of corn, that cannot be good for the future of a global food staple. In a few minutes, we will learn why corn is endangered, if it is endangered, and what is endangering it, when we speak with historian Helen Ann Curry, author of the new book, Endangered Maize, Industrial Agriculture and the Crisis of Extinction. Helen is Peter Lipton Lecturer in History of Modern Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Churchill College at Cambridge, where she researches and teaches the history of recent science and technology, especially as it relates to food and agriculture. She's also the author of the 2016 book, Evolution Made to Order: Plant Breeding and Technological Innovation in the 21st and the 20th Century America. Since August 2020, Helen has led the project From Collection to Cultivation, funded by the Wellcome Trust. This team of researchers is rewriting the histories of how today's food crops came to be. You can follow Helen on Twitter at HA Curry, that's Curry, and you can find out more about Helen at helenanncurry.com. I'm your bitter, blind, broke, gap-toothed radio show podcast live streaming host, Chuck Mertz. Producing is Sebastian Whooper. Sebastian, what's new by you, sir?
Inching ever closer to the much desired green card. I went through the green card medical exam last week, and I have a little bit of an axe to grind. I mean, I have a whole arsenal of axes to grind. Otherwise, I guess I wouldn't be on this program. So, talking to the civil surgeon, that's the title that the people who do
the physical.
Yeah.
Civil surgeon.
Civil surgeon.
Crazy. Yes. Do they wear a uniform?
No. It's basically just any kind of medical practitioner, I guess, who can do that, like your regular internist, but they have to undergo some sort of certification. But anyway, so this doctor who has his practice close by here.
Okay.
So while we were filling out all these forms, he was himself an immigrant. And in his thick accent, he tells me, he loves America, he loves this country and everything, but the country has problems. And I'm like, yeah, I agree, the country has problems. And then he goes on, when it started last year with the monuments and then all the crime, and I'm just like, here is a very well educated, ostensibly, person who, just like so many other people in this country, live in this kind of counter reality where crime is rampant and always on the upswing, and the police are helpless, which is basically what he told me, that he thought that the police were helpless because they couldn't do anything, and unlike where he came from, and that just gets me frustrated.
Yeah,
Because, people live in this world constructed by the media, and politicians have to address this counter-reality, not the real reality, and keep funneling money to the police instead of to the, programs that would actually
help out,
diminish crime.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I'd be freaked out about that kind of conversation with somebody while you're getting immigration papers. Like, is this a setup? Am I supposed to agree with them? Is this being recorded? That's a really bizarre thing to be discussing citizenship with somebody who is supposed to be determining whether your citizenship should be taking place or not. I would feel really freaked out. Usually at this time when I'm exchanging pleasantries with the producer, as I am doing right now with Sebastian, I complain about suffering from some physical ailment or another, whether it's my bad back that I injured years ago on a job site, my lack of intestinal fortitude inherited from my father that has forced me to miss shows in the past, or my most recent bout with bronchitis, which caused a persistently sore throat for over 2 months, a sore throat that was later determined to be caused by acid reflux, which is related to my intestinal problems. I usually explain that what is new by me is the same old, and that is, one way or the other, I'm suffering with some physical problem. But today, no longer on my meds for the stomach problem, without waking up coughing and no stiffness in my back, I actually feel fine. And it's a really, really weird feeling. It's like all of a sudden being sober. But more important than me not being in one pain or the other, which is odd, Sebastian, what's this week's question from hell for our listening audience?
This week's question from hell is, what is more likely to happen this year than the This Is Hell anniversary party, currently scheduled for July 2020, July 2021, July 2022?
So what is more likely to happen this year than the This Is Hell anniversary party, currently scheduled for July 23rd, 2022? Sebastian will have some of your answers following our guest. The person with our favorite answer to this week's question from hell wins your choice of whatever This Is Hell merchandise you want: the This Is Hell t-shirt, the tote bag, the face covering or the face mask, the coffee mug, the This Is Hell Guide to the 21st Century flash drive, featuring dozens of interviews from the 2000s, the trucker's cap, which comes in a couple of different colors, the winter beanie, or toque if you prefer. You can check out all of our swag right now by going to thisishell.com and clicking on support, where you'll see all the ways you can contribute to completely listener-supported This Is Hell. Remember, without you, we got nothing, so thanks to all of you for your support. Thanks to Jonathan B. of Chula Vista, California, who picked up 2 This Is Hell t-shirts. Thanks, Jonathan. You can leave your answer to this week's question from hell at our Facebook page, facebook.com/thisishellradio. You can direct message it to us via Twitter at thisishellradio. You can email it to us at chuck@thisishell.com. But we must have your answer by the end of this week's show, when we are announcing this week's winner, following Jeff Dorchin and the Moment of Truth. During this week's Moment of Truth, Jeff takes sides in the werewolf v. vampire war. Didn't know that was an ongoing war. Sebastian will have more of your answers to this week's question from hell following our conversation with Helen on Endangered Maize. Email us, message us via Facebook, or tweet at us on Twitter with your guest or topic suggestions, or tell us anything you'd like to share on the show, and we will likely read it on air. Randall L. sent a guest suggestion, writing, "Hi, Chuck. I'm a podcast listener who found my way to This Is Hell 5 years ago, more or less. It's hard to calculate how much time has passed in this changeless Groundhog Day of a hellscape that we share, so just count me as one of those long-time listener, first-time caller types. Your January 12th carbon dominance interview with Jeff Nesbitt has been bouncing around in my brain for the past week. What struck me hardest from that hard-hitting interview was the idea that the fossil fuel industry, or as he calls it, the fossil fool industry, eased our acceptance of widespread methane use by calling it natural gas. Such a simple and obvious and invisible idea until a Jeff Nesbitt comes along and calls attention to it. That little mind bomb really blew me away. Listening to that podcast motivated me to do 2 things regarding This Is Hell. I ordered a This Is Hell winter beanie/toque from your website because you have more than earned my support, and my head is cold. I'm also sending you this email suggesting a topic or guest for an upcoming show that I think relates to the subject of oil industry power and political manipulation. please consider sharing the story of Stephen Donziger with your listeners. I think Donziger himself is an excellent spokesperson for his own case, or if you would prefer, there are some easily Googled journalists who have been covering this story. Donziger is an environmental and human rights lawyer. In 2011, Donziger won an unprecedented and potentially precedent-setting $9.5 billion court judgment in Ecuador against Chevron on behalf of indigenous Ecuadorians who were poisoned by toxic waste that Chevron dumped in the Amazon rainforest. Chevron has never paid a cent of that award. Instead, they have been using the legal system to punish Donziger for successfully suing them. They did this in order to deter him and any other lawyers who might challenge oil companies in the future on a similar basis. Chevron accused Donziger of manufacturing evidence. In that case, they sued him and accused him of withholding evidence in that lawsuit. A federal judge in the Southern District of New York in that case tried to charge Donziger with criminal contempt of court, but the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York refused to prosecute the case. The judge then, in a rarely used procedure, appointed a private corporate law firm that has also represented Chevron as special prosecutors to prosecute Stephen Donziger for that criminal contempt of court. He was denied a jury trial in that case, lost his law license, and was found guilty in that case by a different judge and sentenced to 6 months in prison. That 6-month sentence came after Donziger had spent more than 2 years under house arrest in a process that the United Nations experts found lacks any legal basis and is in violation of numerous fair trial standards. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found that his detention is in retaliation for his work as a lawyer for the indigenous communities in Ecuador. As of January 21st, Stephen Donziger will have spent 900 days in detention, 45 of them in a jail cell for the crime of successfully suing an oil company for polluting the Amazon and injuring an indigenous community. I've never met Donziger or anyone who is part of this case. I'm not an expert in legal affairs or environmental sciences. I am simply an appalled and sickened citizen of the country that is persecuting him on behalf of the oil industry. And I'm an air breather and water drinker who hopes that he and people like him can help us protect our future. If you can't get justice for Donziger, why should other publicly minded lawyers and activists sacrifice their freedoms to achieve anything? This story should be much more widely known, but media attention to this case has been sparse and largely sympathetic to Chevron, even from supposedly liberal media like CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. A search on the NPR website only came up with a few mentions from 2014 that portray him as an attention-seeking crank who is getting what he deserved for harassing Chevron. Just disgusting. Chuck, I hope I've convinced you that This Is Hell should help pick up the slack and spread the word about his injustice. A fellow damned soul, Randall L. in Silver Spring, Maryland. And then he offers links to the free Donziger website, Chris Hedges' most recent writing on Stephen Donziger, someone by the name of Dr. Nan M. Greer, an ecological anthropologist who has written on Chevron's eco-crimes. Thanks, Randall. This is definitely a story that I am interested in, and thank you for reminding me and sending the links. Also, you're not the only one blown away by the fact that natural gas is methane. That seems to be something that nobody, including myself, knew. We'll have more of your feedback following our conversation with Helen and Ann on the threat to crop diversity and what can be done about it. We'll have your answers to this week's question from Hell, which is, what is more likely to happen this year than This Is Hell's anniversary party, currently scheduled for July 23rd, 2022. Live from late capitalism, where we know the price of everything, but the value of nothing, this is Hell. We all know that the future of our food is in danger. At least it appears to be. Why else would we be storing away crop seeds, collecting them from all over the world to store them in seed vaults as a kind of rainy day fund for us to use when they're needed? But how are future crops protected when they're stored away in vaults? And what happens to things like natural evolution and cross-pollination when they're sequestered away? Here to help us understand what is meant by a crop being endangered and how it got that way, historian Helen Ann Curry is author of the new book, Endangered Maize, Industrial Agriculture and the Crisis of Extinction. Welcome to This Is Hell, Helen.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being on the show. This is something that we have not discussed that much in the past. We did have a guest on a few years ago about biodiversity and how it is misunderstood. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation as a follow-up to that. You write, each year the world's farmers produce more than 1 billion tons of maize or corn. Their annual collective harvest provides an estimated 20% of the world's caloric intake. In the 21st century, maize dominates farms and diets and does so across remarkably diverse cultural and ecological conditions. So how dependent are we on corn when it comes to feeding the world? And are we too dependent on corn for our diets? Is the agriculture sector, the industry, too dependent on corn?
That's a great set of questions. And I think a good way to start diving into them is in some ways to point out my own expertise is as a historian. And so to understand a lot about corn as a historian of science, I've come to depend on the scholarship of a lot of other people. But yes, absolutely. I think agricultural economists and agronomists would tell us that raising corn or maize is absolutely central, especially to feeding livestock, to a slightly lesser extent, actually kind of depends on where you are in the world, to feeding people. And not everyone would agree that we're depending on corn too much. I'm sure there are plenty of advocates for a kind of streamlined, efficient industrial system that churns out cheap grain in the way that we do today. But there are also plenty of voices on the other end of that spectrum. People, crop scientists, conservation biologists, people interested in agricultural alternatives who would say, we probably are due for a diversification of our agricultural system, and rethinking our dependency on cheap grain like maize is one way to start.
So what about non-food use of corn? Does the development of corn as a fuel, has that had an impact on the lack of diversity when it comes to corn?
Well, I think it would be more appropriate to point to the pressure to produce more and to produce more at a lesser cost than to specifically, for example, pinpoint ethanol. In the book Endangered Maize, I really look at the whole history of efforts to conserve genetic diversity in crops and think about what have been the pressure points in reducing diversity. And I refer to maize, but it's actually a trend that we see across many different crops, right? So, and not everything is transformed into a fuel product in the way that maize is. And so the pressures that tend to come to bear on crops that cause the reduction in diversity in those crops and the reduction in genetic diversity in particular comes from a variety of factors. And what links them together is often this emphasis on productivity, on the simplification of agricultural systems, also on the kind of consolidation of the seed industry, so fewer inputs into the system. But it's really kind of all of those things. And so I wouldn't point to ethanol specifically.
You also point out that by many accounts, that crop diversity is in danger. A plant scientist managing an international gene bank in central Mexico curates thousands of samples of corn from around the world. Maize's genetic diversity is unique, she emphasizes, and must be protected in order to ensure the survival of the species and allow for breeding better varieties. Now, the agricultural industry often employs monocrop planning. As a 2014 article by the Indiana University South Bend Sustainability Project states, monocrop farming is the practice of growing large amounts of one crop on the land. This type of farming does not provide the diversity needed in our diets or to our ecosystem. A clear way to send a message that monocropping is unacceptable, as the major source of farming is to support local, organic, diverse farms. How much of a danger is a lack of diversity to continued corn production? Can the agricultural sector embrace both diversity and monocrop production?
Wow, that's a fascinating question. I think, to bring us to the seed bank that you started there with the quotation from the seed bank manager in Mexico, she managed until her recent retirement from that post. She and now her successor managed a collection of thousands of individual samples or accessions of maize from really around the world. That collection has a particular strength in maize of the Americas. And maize originated in Mexico. That's where it was first domesticated. And the diversity of maize that we see across the continents is really impressive. And so the reason that collection in Mexico exists is because as farmers, especially initially in the United States, transitioned from growing what would have been local varieties, so whether farm-saved seed or locally adapted varieties produced by agricultural experimentation, as farmers transitioned to more professionally bred seed over time, they increasingly moved towards similar varieties. So they kind of clustered around the ones that performed best in the field, that gave them the greatest reward for the money that they invested in seed, right? So farmers, in a lot of ways, benefit from a move towards, professionally bred and produced seed, and through certain kinds of shifts in agricultural production towards, getting more out of every inch of land, right? And so as farmers made the shift towards more standardized, more potentially genetically homogenized strains of maize, researchers, including plant breeders, started to get worried that the varieties which had a greater range of diversity, some of those local varieties of the past, increasingly by the 1950s, they were worried about farmers, peasant and indigenous farmers across the Americas, potentially transitioning from their local varieties, which would have been grown for kind of countless generations in different regions, recombined and crossed and developed. Breeders started to worry that all of this heterogeneity out in the world was disappearing and that they wouldn't have access to it to develop crops for the future. And so that's really the origin of seed banks is these kind of offsite storage facilities for genetically diverse varieties. Those came about because scientists and especially plant breeders worried that they would lose the very materials that could be useful to them in breeding the varieties of the future. But of course, the varieties that they were breeding were those ones feeding into a more industrialized style of production, right? And so that's where this is coming back to your question about the relationship between diversity and monocrop. The great diversity of the world's crops was very early on recognized as an essential kind of input, if you will, into a style of farming that didn't necessarily have that diversity at the center.
So is this a matter of big agriculture guiding the science or science guiding big agriculture?
Well, can I push back on that? What do you mean here by science?
The breeders were the people who are breeding the seeds. Are they people who are coming up with the ideas first, and then the big agriculture is listening to them, or is it they're listening to big agriculture and they're trying to pursue the goals of big agriculture rather than what might be seen as the more objective goal of seed breeding?
Well, if we look back in history, right, the first kind of concerns that scientists raised about the possibility of losing diversity are in the 1880s and the 1890s, especially in Europe, when farmers started to rely more on local agricultural research stations, which were producing improved, quote unquote, improved lines of different crops that performed better for those farmers. And we might think of that as a period of time that's prior to big agriculture. Big ag didn't exist in that moment in time, right? So this is a trend. Plant breeding might inevitably produce these kind of bottlenecks in terms of genetic diversity. And the question is really, does the style of industrial farming and its association with transnational corporations and their interest in their own bottom lines that we see after World War II, right? Does big agriculture intensify a pattern that we would see no matter what when it came to something like breeding better strains of corn and wheat and other crops, which essentially we do want to do, right? We depend agriculture today, whether it's organic farming or whether it's industrial farming, depends on improved crop varieties, depends on the work of plant breeders. And what plant breeders do is winnow out the kinds of genetic material that's not helpful to produce something that will perform better, on the farm, irrespective of what kind of farm that is. So it's not just big agriculture. It's a much more complex set of phenomena than that.
And you write that subsistence cultivators are the only farmers who still grow many of Mexico's historical maize varieties, and their efforts ensure the crop's continued adaptation to changing needs and environments. Economic policies have made it difficult for them to carry on, however, and experts worry that farmers are sowing and maintaining this diversity at an ever-increasing cost to themselves and their families. So subsistence farmers are keeping the corn diversity going. Are big ag's attempts to buy up small farms, then, a threat to not only feeding the world, but a threat to feeding that diversity?
I would say that farmers' loss of land, particularly in places in the global south, the marginalization of subsistence farmers and their cultivation methods, and whether the land is whether small farms are being bought up by big agriculture, or whether farmers are being pushed off their land, in some cases by conservation enterprises. It's a mixed picture. But when farmers don't have access to the land that they need, or the time that they need to cultivate what we might think of as kind of traditional crop varieties, that's absolutely a cause of the loss of diversity. And I really like that you brought in, for example, the farmers in Mexico who keep many of what are called the different races of maize in Mexico in cultivation. Because in the lead to the show, you said we're down to just one maize variety. And of course we're not. There's a considerable amount of extant crop diversity in the world, not just in our big crops like maize and wheat, but of course in many other crops besides. And one of the stories that we see in looking through the long history of efforts to conserve crop genetic diversity is that since the late 1980s and 1990s, many experts in crop diversity have begun to insist insist in increasingly ardent tones that the real pathway to conservation is to support those farmers who do still grow different strains of maize, different strains of wheat, different kinds of potatoes. And so there has been a recognition that, for example, the Svalbard seed vault can't be everything, that we also need to be sustaining communities and cultivators in place, that we need to make sure their land and their resources are protected and defended.
You write on the history of maize to trace the origins of and motivations behind accounts of diversity's loss, and to show how these shaped the methods and tools of conservation adopted by scientists and states. This research reveals interests and concerns that are often obscured or deliberately masked by simple declensionist tales. Who is doing this obscuring, and why deliberately mask the new diversities, if you will, with tales of decline? Why the pessimism without the optimism? Who benefits from such a focus on decline?
I think that's a really great question. So what I'm referring to there in speaking of a declensionist tale, this kind of narrative of decline, is the story that we hear, and I think we hear it in news reports about crop diversity. It's the simplified way of discussing is to say that we're, it's headed for extinction. This is a crisis scenario. There is an inexorable trajectory of what people call agricultural modernization or industrialization. And as farmers around the world transition to new styles of production, diversity will be lost, right? So when we tell that kind of story about crop diversity, and scientists have characterized things in that way at various different points, say over the past century, I think there's a failure in talking about crop loss to be talking about what's happening to the farmers who grow those crops. So to give you an example, one of the key moments in which there's mobilization to gather up all sorts of genetically diverse crops from different places in the world. This is in the 1970s. There's this moment of intensity, and it's specifically because of the increased pace at which development programs are unfolding, especially development programs around agriculture. So you might be familiar with the phrase the Green Revolution, which picks out a sort of uptick in agricultural productivity in Latin America and Asia, especially in the late 1960s. That's associated with several different shifts in agricultural production, from use of synthetic fertilizers to greater irrigation capacity, but is also very much associated with the introduction of new varieties of wheat and new varieties of rice, which would be more productive than what farmers were traditionally growing. And this idea that this large scale kind of global even transformation in agricultural production, including a changeover in seeds, drove especially scientists and plant breeders to organize new international collecting and seed bank missions, or seed bank construction and collecting missions in the 1970s. But of course, you might also ask a question about what was happening to those farmers, right? Not just to their seeds. And in the next decade or so after that kind of salvage mission of collecting was undertaken, collecting, that I should add, was seen to be essential because the changeover in agricultural production was assumed to be so good for farmers, right? The Green Revolution would, and in some cases did, feed hungry people, addressed issues of famine, for example, in India in the late 1960s. But as farmers were assumed to be taking on new seeds, and that this change style of production would be good for them. But of course, that ended up being a kind of mixed story in the decades that followed. And many researchers uncovered increases in inequality, the exacerbation of environmental problems. And so this narrative of inevitable changeover in agricultural production, changeover in seed that had to happen as a part of this modernization process, that story really needed actually the kind of integration of the experiences of the farmers in those places to really be thinking about what it would mean for farmers to be changing over to a new style of production, maybe marginalized from communities that they'd been a part of before as a result, for example, of losing land or other experiences. And so talking about those experiences was not part of the story of agricultural modernization initially. And it's part of the important piece of the history kind of to restore in telling this narrative of crop conservation.
So you point out that that your research reveals how conservationists forge their methods for preserving crop plants, their modes of collection, classification systems, storage technologies, and negotiation tactics around expectations of social, political, and economic transformations that would eliminate diverse communities and cultures. So was conservation focused on eliminating older, potentially indigenous practices of diversity? Did Western science view even ancient practices as able to be improved upon, if not made obsolete?
So I wouldn't say that the agenda of conservation itself was or is tied up with the aim of trampling out, if you will, or trampling out diversity or past practices. I think the agenda of agricultural improvement or agricultural modernization has often seen that as a necessary byproduct. So I guess that's really what I was trying to get at in discussing the development programs of the 1970s. The idea was that, there is a development theory held that there were kind of a staged progression of social and economic development that societies would go through, and changing over agricultural production we might think of as one subset of that vision of modernization, right? And as part of that process, quote unquote peasant farmers would be transformed into quote unquote modern ones, right? And modern farmers would tend to look more the same all the world over in comparison to the cultures and practices and communities that preceded them.
So what happens to conservation, or what happens to crop diversity when it takes seeds out of nature, does not allow them to continue new and diverse strains? Do seed banks put local seed diversity on hold temporarily?
Well, in some ways, it depends on the kind of seed bank. So you referenced Svalbard in the opening to the show, and Svalbard is what's called a safety duplicate facility. It operates as a kind of backup for many of the world's other seed and gene banks. And that really is long-term cold storage to be drawn on in case of an emergency. And so those are very much frozen for if needed. I suppose with the hope that they will never be needed in most cases. That the seed banks that are closer to farm fields in different parts of the world will be able to withstand, environmental and institutional and financial shocks of different kinds. At the other end of the spectrum, you have community seed banks and other organizations that are very much centered in communities. So there are some good examples in the United States. For example, Native Seed Search in Arizona is a community-centered seed saving organization that certainly has a seed bank associated with it. But its agenda is to see seeds in cultivation, and in particular to see varieties in cultivation among Native American farmers. So participating in kind of regenerative, restorative work as well. And so the question about, what happens in a seed bank really depends on which seed bank we're talking about. I would also add to that I think the work that seed banks do is really important in setting aside materials that are in many ways fragile, so that we could potentially research them or draw on them in the future. I don't think there would not be a good argument for ending the practice of seed and gene banking at all. I think it's an essential resource for our agriculture of the future. I think the question, and it's not just my question, it's a question that researchers from different fields, and especially within the sciences of crop diversity, have asked, is whether, well, one, how we can make seed banks both more robust, and how we can make sure that the materials that are in them make it out more often, whether that's in use by professional breeders or distributed to kind of farming communities or other people who want to grow and work with those seeds. And then also supplementing the work of ex situ seed banks with in situ conservation. And as I say, this is a significant area of work and research today that depends both on scientists, on especially nonprofit institutions, but state government projects as well, and on farmers themselves and growers to participate in.
You write sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and that's really, this sort of supplementary practice we want the seed banks as the backups and the farmers really as the conservation in practice.
But they haven't always worked together. You write that the resourcist vision and seed bank conservation historically associated with the United States and European imperialism, and by the 1970s aligned with increasingly powerful agribusiness as well, eventually drew criticism from diverse quarters. What is meant by the resourcist vision, so our listeners understand?
Yeah, absolutely. So the resourcist vision is this idea that the seeds of diverse crop varieties, so what are called land races, locally adapted varieties that farmers might grow in a particular region, the seeds of those varieties harbor a kind of genetic diversity, not a kind of, but they definitely harbor genetic diversity within them. And that by saving the seed in something like a seed bank, you set that aside to be accessed and used in the future. And that is thinking of seeds as the source or the repository of what scientists refer to as genetic resources. So that's the resource vision sees a seed or seeds of diverse varieties not as necessarily something to be planted season after season, but something that can be basically mined for future value, right? That's what the resourcist vision that I'm referring to there is.
You also write that those who were critical of the resources vision and seed bank conservation, quote, included plant scientists who prioritized continued evolution over static security and cold storage, and representatives of national governments, especially in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, which felt that they were being stripped of valuable products by more powerful countries and transnational corporations. So are seed banks an attempt, intentionally or not, at taking seed evolution out of the hands of farmers in the global South? Is seed bank conservation about the North's control over food?
Well, in many ways, this was a debate that really raged in the 1980s and 1990s. I mentioned a little bit ago this scramble to collect seeds in the 1970s on the heels of what was seen to be accelerated development of agriculture, especially in the global South. So there was a kind of scramble for seeds that resulted in quite significant collections of many different kinds of crops being put together and held by and large in seed banks that were either located in the global North, so in Europe or the United States, or that were controlled by international organizations that were themselves also kind of orchestrated or operated by European and US actors. So there was this suddenly a considerable stockpile, if you will, of seeds, mostly collected from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, being stored outside of the control of those countries. And so in the 1980s, and this specifically, a debate came about in the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, in which various different actors, seed activists, representatives of the global South in the FAO, some scientists as well interested in conservation, came together and really objected to a system that had arisen that was seemingly so inequitably distributed in terms of access, and that what had been thought of or often referred to as a global patrimony of humanity was actually something that seemed to be very, very tightly in the control of just a subset of countries of the world, when in fact much of it had been generated and maintained and kept extant by farmers, again, in the global South. So this kind of North-South divide especially had seemed to have arisen. And at the same time, this is when intellectual property protection in plant varieties came to be tightened in many parts of the world as well. So it seemed also newly possible that those seeds could be used as resources, going back to the resources vision, into crop varieties that could then be patented and not obtained by farmers in countries that might have produced seeds and varieties that had contributed to their development. And so this was really the territory of fierce contestation in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And it's the set of contests that led ultimately to what's called the Seed Treaty, which is an international regime that really governs the keeping of seeds in global seed bank collections around the world, as well as their transfer between countries. And the Seed Treaty was and is an effort to move towards circumstances of greater equity in control over seeds. It's not a perfect instrument, and debates and changes to it still continue, but that's really where those contests of the 1980s led.
We are speaking with historian Helen Ann Curry, author of the new book, Endangered, Maize, Industrial Agriculture and the Crisis of Extinction. You can follow Helen on Twitter at H.A. Curry. You can find out more about Helen at helenanncurry.com. She is also the author of the 2016 book, Evolution Made to Order, Plant Breeding and Technological Innovation in 20th Century America. You write researchers tended overwhelmingly to dismiss the potential role of farmers in making and maintaining varieties, especially when those farmers were peasant and indigenous cultivators overseas. To you, what explains that dismissiveness? Is this simply, and not so simply, just racism conducted by the breeders, or is it something else?
So I think it's really important to flag up that summary is contextualizing the early history, as opposed to the circumstances that we see today. So when with the development of new technologies and interventions or new crop varieties in the early part of the 20th century, with those developments, there was a very particular vision of what it meant to be a good and productive and modern farmer, and that as I was suggesting earlier, in terms of thinking about development programs, it meant putting aside tradition, putting aside the cultivation methods, the techniques, the crops of the past, and moving towards the model that good science had to offer. So a lot of histories point to a program that was initiated in Mexico in the 1940s, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, so a private American philanthropy, which sent American trained, U.S. scientists to Mexico to conduct research that would allow Mexican agriculture to modernize on the American style, right? And so this vision of, what is good research as well as what is good agriculture, and that obviously the vision there was agriculture based on this understood to be good science, and so a convergence towards a particular model for growing crops, for bringing them to market, and so on. And so in that moment of time, in the mid 20th century, so prior to the indigenous peoples movement, prior to peasant organizing and resistance, which is what we see much more of today, there weren't necessarily the venues for the counter voice to that kind of monolithic vision to come forward. And so when I write about the racism or the racist assumptions that got baked into some early agricultural programs, including some seed collecting projects, I'm really referring to that vision rather than to any ideas that inform this kind of work today.
And you write that these narratives about people are more important to understanding the shape that conservation efforts have taken in the past 130 years than are the stories told about plants. The idea that crop varieties might be endangered has always been linked to the idea that a particular community or way of life is about to disappear. This connection has remained stable through successive attempts to preserve crop diversity, despite the variety of political projects they represented. It is this imagined extinction and its implications, and not that of plant varieties themselves, which has produced the approaches to conserving crop diversity we rely on today. So to what extent is the real threat of diversity manufactured, and any reaction to it undermined by this narrative of imminent disappearance?
I wouldn't say that the narrative of diversity is manufactured in any way. Sorry, the narrative of diversity's decline in terms of crop diversity. I think there's a tremendous amount of good research out there that shows that in many places and in many different crops, we have lost varieties or the varieties in cultivation have significantly diminished, such that we've been able to track them, which is actually a quite challenging thing to do. So crop genetic diversity is being lost, and that isn't a question. But this narrative of decline, when it's told in a kind of totalizing way about this inexorable trajectory of loss, is one that sometimes has missed, I think, places where diversity survives and thrives. And so the narrative of loss is kind of patchy. So it's not manufactured. I think there's more a question of being careful to contextualize the nature of the loss that happens. I think. Can you repeat the quote that you entered with on there?
Yes, if I can find it in my notes. I can't even find it.
If not, don't worry.
Yeah,
there was something. Yeah.
What I was saying was that the idea that crop varieties might be endangered has always been linked to the idea that a particular community or way of life is about to disappear. This connection has remained stable through successive attempts to preserve crop diversity, despite the variety of political projects they represented. It is this imagined extinction and its implications, and not that of plant varieties themselves, which has produced the approaches to conserving crop diversity we rely on today. That was the quote that I had read.
Excellent. Thank you. That's so helpful. What I wanted to call attention to there, and this is a really important part of the story, and what I mean by the hidden narratives of extinction, or the ones that don't get talked about, is when individuals, whether they're plant explorers of the 1910s or crop conservationists of the 1950s, when they realized that communities were losing the varieties that they had cultivated over many generations, and attempted to salvage them from those communities to be kept in collections or in seed banks, there was not always the kind of acknowledgement that one would want to see, I think, as someone looking back from the 2020s, where we are privileged with hindsight. There wasn't always the acknowledgement about the assumptions they were making about the extinction and endangerment of particular peoples, right? So they were also taking that trajectory for granted. And so relinking some of the stories of conservation activities to the assumptions that individuals had about farmers and their communities and lifestyles is important. So, for example, the book opens with some of the early collections of maize that were conducted in the United States in the 1910s that were motivated by this idea of losing diversity, which targeted Native American farmers and reservations, especially in the American West. And those were really underpinned by a settler colonial narrative of inevitable indigenous disappearance. And so those collections of maize diversity are often talked about as, the product of this early forward-looking vision about the way in which, farmers would transition to new varieties and varieties would be lost. But when you go back to the documents, what those collectors were thinking was that Native American farmers themselves would not be around, right? And I think that really puts the salvage mission in a quite different light.
You write that hybrid corn set a course for the seed industry, which underwent a similarly dramatic consolidation from myriad independent operations to a handful of transnational conglomerates. Hybrid corn influenced U.S. foreign policy from Cold War food power to the North American Free Trade Agreement as the government looked to unload mountains of cheap grain sustained by farm subsidies. It changed diets, and not for the better. Inexpensive corn-fed beef and high-fructose corn syrup are often implicated in the steady rise of diet-related health problems like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. So is hybrid corn, the corn that we generally eat, is that corn bred because of power and profits more than it is bred for nutrition?
I would certainly agree that it is not bred for nutrition. That is absolutely correct. I think historically, actually, across many, many different kinds of crops, especially the ones that are big commodity grains, the emphasis in breeding for a century and more has been on making the pile of grain bigger, as opposed to improving the qualities in the pile of grain. There's obviously exceptions to this narrative, but by and large, it's about producing varieties that respond to the inputs that we can give them, so that more can be squeezed out of every acre that's planted.
You also quote Mexican activist Gustavo Esteva describing how corn is present even in the most unexpected forms in most displays of Mexico's culture today, not just in cuisine, but in art, language, dress, and even everyday ways of thinking and behaving. What happens to that kind of culture when that corn becomes universally generic with hybrid corn, when the local varieties are supplanted by industrial hybrid corn? What is the impact on that culture?
Well, this very question is one of the reasons that there have been in the past couple of decades really impressive and coordinated action in Mexico to um, defend Mexican farmers and Mexican eaters from the influx of cheap corn from the United States. Obviously, this intensified around the time that NAFTA was signed in the early 1990s, but it has continued since with particular objections to transgenic maize and the idea that the genes of transgenic maize could move into the land races that are native to Mexico, but also very much informed by the idea that farmers losing the resources, the land, the markets needed to successfully keep growing different varieties or different races of Mexican maize will be a true cultural loss in Mexico and in other countries that similarly have kind of rich cultures of maize cultivation. And so I think we need look no further than the protests that arose. There's a network in defense of maize, a campaign that was organized around "Without maize, there is no country" in Mexico, and that these initiatives should signal to us just how essential cultivation of crop diversity for a crop that's so culturally entrenched is to a wide range of people, scientists, activists, indigenous peoples, and more.
You also mentioned this idea that suggests that all the diversity we will ever have is already in place and keeps many would-be conservationists fixated on an idealized past, even as they strive to secure the future. So is the assumption of seed banks that this is the most diversity we will ever have and therefore we need to save it? And if so, is that the case? What impact does that, putting these seeds on hold and this diversity on hold, what does that mean moving forward for feeding the world?
I mean, that's a great question. I think in the popular imagination of seed banks, to the extent that there is such a thing, the vision of these banks is as, storehouses of a diversity that is dwindling. I have to say, I think there's a sort of shared sentiment among people who cultivate heritage crops often that they're cultivating something from the past. There's a notion of a static entity that's been saved or it's been rediscovered as the thing that it was. But of course, plant breeders are really active and productive, and thousands and thousands and thousands of new crop varieties are registered every year in every different kind of crop. So all crops are on the move. Crop diversity is being created. Farmers who grow traditional, maybe farm in ways that we think of as more traditional, they're engaging in the acquisition of new seeds, they're exchanging seeds, there is genetic interchange, new things are coming about. And so there are a lot of reasons to really think about diversity as being not static, right? So not just in motion, but also being created in different contexts, right? So I think there are more opportunities than maybe we've collectively taken advantage of in thinking about the imperative to conserve crop diversity. There are more opportunities to think about what it would mean to conserve creatively. So not to focus on static collections or varieties saved just as they were, the kind of heritage vegetable, but to think about diversity in motion and to really, I think it would require action on multiple different fronts. And obviously there are scientists, activists, gardeners, farmers who are engaged in this project. But it really requires sustaining initiatives that focus on diversifying agricultural systems as much as anything else.
And you write that diversity in the seed bank and uniformity in the field have gone hand in hand. Why does diversity in a seed bank lead to uniformity in the field? Well,
this really links back to what I was saying before about the early in development of seed banks, their establishment as institutions for this resourcist vision, right? So genetic resources in the bank was actually in the 1950s, say, and at different instances before and after, a vision in which it was okay for farmers to transition to growing a less diverse subset of crops, and for that not to be risky, because if something happened and we needed to take crop development in a new direction, the materials that breeders would need to do that would still be available. And so that's this idea of the seed bank, the recognition of the importance of diversity, and creating this off-site institution to warehouse diversity arguably allowed breeders, and in some cases still allows them, to be cavalier about creating varieties that might be vulnerable as a result of their genetic uniformity.
You point out that there is an alternative to this line of thinking. As the historian Courtney Full-of-Love reminds us, seeds are always in a state of becoming never fixable. Social scientists who investigate seed maintenance and exchange among farmers emphasize that varieties are not stable objects, locatable as pure strains. So if crops are not fixable, as in a fixed, stable state, do seed banks place them in a fixed, stable state? Wouldn't that stunt any development they may have had as crops?
Well, I mean, that's part of it's part of the fiction of many different aspects of seed development. Absolutely, to take a seed and turn it into a sample that's then registered and characterized in terms of its different qualities and traits and where it came from in the world, and then to enter that into a seed bank. That is to abstract it from time and from environment, and to set a goal of keeping it just as it is as long as possible. But we might think about, I mentioned our intellectual property systems in plants, so breeders can register new varieties and in different kinds of systems around the world. And this requires showing that they're distinct and they're uniform, but especially that they're stable. And one way in which you create stability is by reducing the genetic diversity in the plant, so it can't kind of move around genetically over time. But that's also a convenient fiction in a way that enables intellectual property regimes to operate. Because in truth, the dividing line between when a variety goes from being the kind of original line to the new line, that's a blurry boundary, unless, of course, you're working with some more recent genetic technologies that might allow you to say that more specifically. But for most of human history, and indeed for most of the crops that we breed around the world, drawing a box around a variety as new and distinct and different is something that we have to do to make the market in seeds work, but doesn't necessarily correspond to the biological reality. So yes, absolutely, the seed bank is marking off a seed as something that is distinct and should be kept without change. But we do that in other places in the agricultural research and marketing system as well. And so there are different ways in which we evade the reality in which seeds are always in a state of becoming, as Courtney Full-of-Love would have it.
One last question for you, Helen. We've been speaking with historian Helen Ann Curry, author of the new book, Endangered Maize, Industrial Agriculture and the Crisis of Extinction. She is also the author of the 2016 book, Evolution Made to Order, Plant Breeding and Technological Innovation in 20th Century America. You can follow Helen on Twitter at H.A. Curry. You can find out more about Helen at Helen Ann Curry. One last question for you, and I promise you we do this with all of our guests. Our final question is what we call the question from hell. The question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. Or it's just a poorly written question. You never really know. You write stories of endangerment are meant to move us and often do. Repeated at a fever pitch with prophecies of catastrophic consequences, they become declarations of crisis. Although often the motivation for change crisis can also be a powerful tool for constraining and limiting it. The anthropologist Joseph Masco insists that in the contemporary world, quote, crisis blocks thought. You add acceptance of crisis as the default condition, as has arguably happened with climate change, for example, can forestall deep engagement with the past, close off hard questions about the present, and diminish the possibilities for radical changes in the future. And you even write that the history of crop conservation is therefore not just about narratives of loss, it's also about acquiescence to crisis. So do tales of endangerment then lead to a loss of hope? And if so, does hopelessness lead to a limiting of our imagination? Because it reminds me of the Thatcherite saying of neoliberalism, there is no alternative, which within that context limits political imagination. And as you quote Masco, crisis blocks thought. So can we opt out of our acquiescence to crisis? And if so, how?
I think we absolutely can. And I'm so glad that you pointed to that quote at the end of the interview here, because one of the things when I reflect on the stories that have been told about crop extinction, the way in which crisis has motivated, for example, salvage of seeds over attention to people and the possibilities for cultivators to develop new varieties in addition to maintain the ones that they already have. I think there's this, if we can see survival and we can hope for things that are new and different, then absolutely we turn our attention to those as the conservation objectives rather than scraping up what remains and putting it in a bank.
Helen, and I really appreciate you being on the show this week. Again, the book is called Endangered Maize, Industrial Agriculture and the Crisis of Extinction. And I think if any of our listeners pick up your book, it's going to really change their view of the way in which they even view things like climate change, but also ideas about crop diversity. I really appreciate your writing, and I really appreciate you being on the show with us.
Thank you for having me here.
Okay, take care.
You too.
Pretending to know what I'm talking about since 1996, this is Hell, if that conversation with Helen Ann on crop diversity and colonialism kind of, and neoliberalism somewhat, and so much more. If all that was in some way enlightening or made you realize that, yes, this really is hell, show your appreciation by either becoming a subscriber to our weekly bonus podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/thisishell, or go to thisishell.com and click on support and see all the ways you can contribute to completely listener-supported This Is Hell. On Patreon every week, I'm now doing This Week in Hell, a review of what I got out of this week's show, which is definitely not what you got out of this week's show, because we're all different and have different views of the world. So show your support by subscribing at patreon.com/thisishell. Remember, without you, we got nothing, so thanks to all of you for your support. Sebastian, please remind the listening audience what is this week's question from hell, and tell us how our listening audience is responding so far.
This week's question from hell is, what is more likely to happen this year than This Is Hell's anniversary party, currently scheduled for July 2020,
No.
July 2021, July 2022?
Yeah, maybe, possibly, who knows? We already have a backup date for Labor Day weekend. That's how much confidence we have in this.
In this day and age, we always need contingencies.
Yep.
Sarah M. Writes, Joe Rogan and Rachel Maddow joined forces to get Air America back up and running. Both promise to behave better this time.
Oh, wow. You know what I loved about Air America is that it's named after a liberal, supposedly, radio outlet, was named after a CIA operation that dealt drugs in Laos. I just love the fact that it's named after a CIA operation. That tells a lot of conspiracy theorists that it's probably just a limited hangout anyway.
Fabio AJL writes, it's more likely that Washington sends Ukraine lethal aid to the same amount that Medicaid for All would have cost.
Yes, I'll buy that.
Jeremy A.T. writes, a riot twice the size of the BLM protests because people just need to dance.
Yeah.
LOL.
I like that.
Matt H. writes, a late August super surge.
Okay.
Lisa B. writes, it better effing happen Because in my head, I've already started curating the artists of it.
We've got a couple of people who are telling me they've already got a whole bunch of artists lined up for the show.
Greg Maxey writes, "The pandemic ends. Oh, but then you'd be able to... never mind." Neil C. writes, "I missed the party because of a huge traffic jam. Somehow self-driving cars develop class consciousness and refuse to move."
Any more?
David R. writes, "Chuck will ask a guest a question from hell that neither he hates to ask, they hate to answer, or any of the audience hates their response." I guess the consequence of that would then be that we withdraw doing questions from hell, or we introduce questions from heaven.
Maybe. Any more?
Nope, that's it.
So you can send us your question or your answer to this week's question from hell. You can email it to us at chuck@thisishell.com. You can tweet it to us at thisishellradio, or you can message it to us via Facebook at facebook.com/thisishellradio. And you can do all of that stuff, all the ways in which you can contact the show. And you can send us your guest or topic suggestions, or tell us anything you'd like to share and like to share on the show. If you want us to share it on the show, send it to us, and we likely will read it on air and share it with the other listeners. This week we heard from Alex M., who is interested in becoming a member of the This Is Hell crew. Alex writes, this is kind of intense. "Hey, Chuck. I'm originally from Illinois and spent some time in Chicago studying fine arts at Columbia College Chicago in the late 2000s to the early 2010s. I wish I could say I came to your podcast back then, as it would have likely saved me quite a bit of heartache and quite a bit of trouble existentially, legally, I don't know why legally, and just about any way I could describe it. While I've danced with lefty feelings and ideas for some time, my study and acknowledgement of formal schools of thought began in earnest only in the past few years, and it has been quite the ride, especially this past year. I've written personally, not an incredible amount, but a fair amount, about that journey and my thoughts surrounding it. Your podcast has helped to inspire this journey, and though I do believe wholeheartedly in the ideals and the possibilities they lead to, I've also come to feel and believe that they have made my life, well, nearly a living hell. Much of it is my fault for many reasons. My journey over the last decade has opened my eyes to seeing through a political lens in which anarcho-socialist politics seem to be the only road to a just, equitable, and sustainable future, but that journey has taken me to some dark places. I am still dealing with this and working on becoming the best person I can, working towards treating everyone with love and respect, ensuring that those I interact with feel heard and valued. It's a work in progress, and I often slip in more ways than one, or get it wrong completely. But I'm trying, I really am, and I'm a little exhausted and quite lonesome, to be a little too honest. I made a large move from Springfield, Illinois to Portland, Oregon in the last year, and I often wonder if I somehow made myself a target in the process. My personal security has not always been the best, and I may have trusted the wrong people at the wrong times, and unfortunately likely continue to do so. I'm reaching out in part to say how much I love the show and how inspirational it is to know that you have done it for so many years. And I'm also writing in part to share a piece of my story. And I'm writing this as a cover letter and or resume. If there is still work available, I would be very interested in knowing what, if any, potential there is for me to join the team. Regardless of this potential, I would like to say thank you for all of your hard work. Kindest regards, Alex. And Alex, I got to just say that self-reflection, that self-awareness, that willingness to think that you might be wrong and that you have space to still grow, that is hopefully the best thing that this show can do for me and for anybody who's listening. But wow, Alex, that's a pretty intense email. Yes, taking in all of what we learn here on This Is Hell every week, every show can be intense and a bit overwhelming at times, and even for me, it's very hellish. You are absolutely correct that searching for a just, equitable, and sustainable future in a present that seems unjust and unsustainable can be a journey that takes you through some really harsh realities. That journey can also be difficult in a world where treating everyone with love and respect is not the norm. Instead, we are supposed to view each other as competition and put our own self-interest first. And Alex, it is a rough journey for me too, learning that the world is not what you are told it is over and over every day, either by the media, the government, or just interactions with friends and family on social media. It can be a real hard journey, but for me it's worth it, and I hope it is for you too. So thanks for the kind words, Alex. They're truly appreciated, and we are putting you on the list of people who we need to contact about being part of the This Is Hell team. We also got an email from Matt A. in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Matt writes to Chuck and the crew, writing with hope that everyone at the studio and at home is doing well. Thank you, Matt. And actually, unbelievably, physically, I'm feeling pretty good. My throat's getting a little bit raspy right now, a little bit of tiny bit of pain, but otherwise, feeling pretty good. Matt says, I'm a longtime listener and short-time backer of This Is Hell. Recently, my girlfriend has also been listening. This follows a brief but misdiagnosed medical condition that has caused her to become legally blind. While we learn to adjust to these changes, the show and the conditions of its production have been inspiring to both of us. Sorry to hear about your girlfriend, Matt, but being legally blind myself, it's not the end of the road. It's just that the road is suddenly a lot more uphill. Matt explains that with his girlfriend's encouragement, he writes, I was wondering about any of the open remote positions. I'm currently based in the Pittsburgh area and would love to help out wherever needed. I can send along a resume or a CV. Previous work experience includes, this is like my list of my work history. People can go to thisishell.com and check out my bio. It is my work history basically in one long run-on sentence. And that's basically what Matt does here. Previous work experience includes deep frying onion rings, pushing wheelchairs at a nursing home, making lattes, selling cigarettes, interviewing refugees, cold calling, hot calling, accidentally giving speeches in front of auditoriums. I don't know how that happens accidentally. Distributing pandemic relief funds, organizing community festivals, and fostering kittens. Currently employed at a local history museum. Sounds amazing. Please let me know what information you might need or if I should go to hell. Belt magazine recently published an article by Nathaniel Johnson that might interest you guys. It details the 2020 Ohio nuclear bribery scandal involving Ohio state legislators. Sincerely, Matt. Matt then includes a link to the Belt magazine article, The Ohio Bribery Scandal Behind the Worst Energy Policy in the Country. So here's a quick excerpt. This is crazy. Over the course of 3 years, Republican Ohio State Representative Larry Householder had taken money from energy companies and transformed it into power. The money built an army of state representatives that elevated him to Speaker of the State House and supported his legislative agenda. It also paved the way for the passage of a law in 2019, House Bill 6, widely recognized as the worst energy policy in the country, according to Leah Stokes, an environmental political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. House Bill 6 nearly halved the renewable power that utilities were required to buy, eliminated energy efficiency laws, handed $1 billion to the state's 2 nuclear power plants, and spent even more money to keep coal plants burning. A recent report from Gable Associates, an energy consulting firm, suggests the law will cost Ohioans $2 billion in excess utility bills and $7 billion in health care costs stemming from pollution over 9 years. When both opponents and backers of House Bill 6 are asked about the scandal, they tend to talk about nuclear power. To opponents, it was a nuclear bailout. To backers, it was a sort of state-level Clean Air Act meant to keep Ohio's 2 nuclear plants from closing, thereby preserving the state's largest source of zero-emissions energy. But nuclear power was mostly a red herring that utilities used to distract from the real threat and thrust of the law: keeping obsolete coal plants and coal mines profitable. Stokes, who wrote the book Short-Circuiting Energy Policy, also says House Bill 6 was really a coal bailout wrapped up in a clean energy and nuclear argument. So thanks, Matt, and now I don't know if we should get the author of the article on the show or if we should talk to Leah Stokes about her book, Short-Circuiting Energy Policy. If you have a guest or topic suggestion or would like to work as a board operator here in studio or join the crew remotely online, or have anything you'd like to share with us about the show, send it to Chuck at thisishell.com. And if you do, we will likely read it on air. Sebastian, who is coming up as our next guest here on This Is Hell?
Tomorrow's guest is urban planning scholar Deyanira Nevares Martinez on her paper Homelessness in Southern California, Street-Level Encounters with the State and the Structural Violence of Performative Productivity for Radical Housing Journal.
Nice Spanish accent there. How many languages do you know?
A few: German, English, Italian. My Spanish, I'm good at pronouncing Spanish. I understand it when people talk to me, but then I usually can only answer in very broken Italian, and then they just look at me like I'm from the moon.
I gave a speech for a Spanish class, and you have to do 2 years of foreign language when I was going to college, and the last thing that you had to do was do a lecture in Spanish. And so I did this lecture on Velázquez's Las Meninas painting, and after it was over, the instructor said, "That was a really great presentation on Las Meninas. So have you ever taken French classes before?" And I said, "No, I mean, like in high school, like 10 years earlier or something, I took some French classes." And he said, "Yeah, because right in the middle of your lecture in Spanish, there was an entire sentence in perfect French, and I cannot speak French. So at some point, my mind just had some sort of synapse lapse, and I went into French mode." Very weird.
I guess that's what they mean when they say you are speaking in tongues.
Yes, it does mean that too. Although it's a lot more attended upon when you're doing it in a Sunday church tent. I'm your bitter, blind, broke, gap-toothed radio show host, podcast host, live streaming host, Chuck Mertz. Producing today's show is Sebastian Wupper. Sebastian, thank you very much. We were not joking. This is hell.
My demon is on my butt. My demon talks to me in profanity like a sailor. And my demon tries to knock me down. And my demon tries to put me on a hell ride.
Thank you for listening to This Is Hell. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.